We'd like to start the next panel. I've chaired many panels during my long career, and I must admit I never chaired such a panel. You have here accumulated experience, incredible accumulated experience. You have here intellectual prowess, and I'm very happy that BESA could have brought, this נבחרת, this type of group together here. I will introduce them, and it will be a roundtable discussion, which is, I don't know how easy is, with this type of guys to do it, but I'll introduce them. First of all, in the order of their sitting, it is Professor Arad. Professor Arad served as National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and served as head of the Israeli National Security Council between 2009 and 2011. During Netanyahu's first term as PM, Dr. Arad was his foreign policy advisor. Arad is currently serving as Professor of Government at the IDC's Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy. In 2005, he established and then headed the Atlantic Forum of Israel. Arad also founded and directed the Institute for Policy and Strategies at the IDC in 2000, where he launched and presided over the annual Herzliya Conference series, a famous establishment that no longer benefits, from the leadership of Uzi Arad. Between 1975 and 1999, Arad served with the Mossad, Israel's foreign intelligence service, where he held senior positions at home and abroad, his last position being director of the intelligence division. I admit I was fortunate to know Professor Arad. I was his TA, teaching assistant, many years ago at Tel Aviv University. Next one in line is Mr. Stephen Simon. He's the former director of the Middle East and North Africa Affairs for the U.S. National Security Council. Stephen Simon is an associate at the Washington Institute, principal at Good Harbor Consulting, and adjunct senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations. He is also a professor of security studies at Georgetown University. Mr. Simon is a former specialist of Middle Eastern affairs at the RAND Corporation. He came to RAND from London, where he was the deputy director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, where I first met him coming for a short stint as a research associate. And afterwards, he was in the same position. He carried the title of Carol Dean Senior Fellow in U.S. Security Studies. Before moving to Britain in 1999, Mr. Simon served as the White House for over 5 years as Director for Global Issues and Senior Director for Transnational Threats. During this period, he was involved in U.S. counterterrorism policy and operation, as well as security policy in Near East and South Asia. These assignments followed a 15-year career at the U.S. Department of State. The next in line, a personal friend, Mr. Rafael Bardaji, former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Spain. Rafael Bardaji is a political scientist and military historian by education, specialized with very early in strategic affairs. He was director of the Strategic Studies Group, a private independent think tank in Madrid, Spain from 1986 to 1993. After spending some years in the private sector, he was appointed senior advisor to the Spanish defense minister in 1996 and national security advisor to the PM in 2000. In 2004, after leaving the government, he was designated director for foreign and security policy at Affiars, the foundation of the Conservative Party. Since then, he has been acting as a consultant to NATO military commands, intelligence services with major corporations. In 2013, he became CEO of Worldwide Strategy, a security consultant firm based in Miami. He is also the executive director of the Friends of Israel Initiative and advocacy group fighting the delegitimization campaigns against Israel. Next is Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India. Menon was National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister from India 2010-2014 and Foreign Secretary of India from 2006 to 2009. He has served as Indian Ambassador or High Commissioner to Israel, where I met him first, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. As a career diplomat, he served in China several times. He knows Mandarin, in Japan, in Austria, and at the embassy and the mission to the IAEA and the UN. He was also seconded to the Department of Atomic Energy in his early 80s and was a member of the Atomic Energy Commission between 2008 and 2014. His professional experience was concentrated on India's neighbors, atomic energy and disarmament, and India's relations with the major powers. The last in line is Major General in Reserve Yaacov Amidror, the former National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel. Major General Amidror served as the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of the National Security Council from 2011 to 2013. And he's now the Anne and Greg Rosshandler Senior Fellow at Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He served in the Israeli Defense Force for 36 years. During his long military career, General Amidror held the following positions: Commander of the IDF colleges, including the National Defense College, Military Secretary for the Ministry of Defense, Minister of Defense, and Director of the Intelligence Analysis Division responsible for national assessment. I asked this distinguished group 3 questions. I'm not sure they'll answer them, but the questions I posed to them: what's your assessment of the Obama administration? What do you think America should do in its foreign policy? And last, how do you think the US position in the world will look not far away in 2020? The first to speak is Professor Uzi Arad. בבקשה.
Thank you very much, Efraim. It's always good to be here, and indeed I salute you for this accomplishment in bringing together for this panel colleagues, in a way, of the same profession. The common denominator being to my colleagues to this panel is that all have indeed served as at the national security apparatus of their respective countries. And it is because of that reason that I would like to devote most of my observations to the things that national security councils really do. But also I do applaud the fact that in selecting who would be present here from such mechanisms, we have a reflection of Israel's own strategic orientation, global one. That is to say, there is, of course, the American presence, which includes not only Steve Simon here, but the American ambassador, who would follow us shortly, has also served on his National Security Council, and that is a reflection of this institution being prominent among its kind. But also we have India, and we have Europe. So it is that network which actually constitutes a network of Israel, some of Israel's strategic relationships, and it is perhaps no coincidence that you have this mix. But the subject being America and Israel's special relationship with it, and that I would like to zoom on. Now, my own involvement in this affair, in American-Israeli relations, has begun since I joined government in 1975, which is, I think, 40 years ago, in the Mossad, essentially at a very interesting chapter of Israeli-American relations, the reassessment, which served as a good educational exercise to all of us, but also registered certain moments which have left some residues. But that was when I started. In the early 80s, I can share with you that at the Mossad, I was in charge of American-Israeli intelligence cooperation. I was head of the North American, Central America included, and that was key to our cooperation at the time. And I was then part of the servicing, the management of the relationship. And then, in fact, in practically everything else that we have been doing in government in different positions, be it in the intelligence community or in the Prime Minister's office, it is clear that the American-Israeli relationship is one that is sustained and managed by an apparatus. But it is run, and that should be recognized from the top. As Yaacov Amidror could tell you, there are 3 or 4 portfolios that are always kept and managed from the very top. One is peace and war, primarily with our rivals. Second, American-Israeli relations. Third, Israel's strategic options. And these things are controlled from the top. And to reiterate, the common denominator to all national security councils is that they perform at the top. And the top is different from the rest of the bureaucracy. It has many commonalities, one of which is immediate access to the real decision makers. You see, Efraim, you a little bit misconstrued it when you call this a panel of policymakers. I don't think that we would, certainly not I, presume to have been a policymaker. But we could make the policies of the decision makers succeed more or less, and sometimes even fail. So that we were at the service of doing that, but in the planning stage, in the executive stage, in the implementation stage, it is very much a bureaucratic, administrative type of performance, and it is to this that I want to address the rest of my comments. Because you see, not only American-Israeli relations changed over the years with the ups and downs of international politics, regional politics, domestic politics and everything, but also the management of this relationship has changed. Now, bureaucrats among you would know management is all important. Processes are all important. Bureaucracies are all important. So the way these things are structured or connected shape things. Now, just for the sake of comparison, let me tell you what it was like when I first served as foreign policy advisor to the same Prime Minister, Netanyahu, during his first term. And then 10 years later, when I served the same political master, Netanyahu, in his second government, but this time as National Security Advisor. In the late 90s, what we had, just to show you, what we had was that in America, you had an American president called Clinton, Democratic. Netanyahu always has the misfortune of serving vis-a-vis Democratic presidents. I think the feeling is it's two-way. I mean, in Washington, they might have expressed their impatience with their misfortune. But that was, and this repeated itself. So there was Clinton out there. The National Security Advisor at that time was Sandy Berger. He was not very much involved. His Middle East hand was a very unassuming character as far as the management of the relationships. Bruce Riedel, a person I knew from his CIA days. Much of the work was done within channels between the departments and the ministries, the intelligence channels, the military channels, the diplomatic channels, but at the top, with the NSC itself, there was no direct and continuous interaction. But there was another one which I made use of with the Vice President's office. He had a National Security Advisor called Leon Fruth, and that was an active channel. And when one had to engage in consultation, it did involve trips. So one had to take the long flight to Washington or back, or Americans would come here. So it was a slow, sometimes phlegmatic process. Telephone calls were less used and so forth. So that was the rhythm. And when there was need for Middle East negotiations, there was the ubiquitous Dennis Ross, who was then at the State Department. And Madeleine Albright was a Secretary of State. So the distribution of management was dispersed in Washington, but in Israel, there was no National Security Council at all. There was only one modest foreign policy advisor, myself, with no staff to speak of. So the management of this took the shape of the vehicle that prevailed, and there was this asymmetry. And that is why at no point did we engage the top or the entire of the NSC from the Prime Minister's office. The Prime Minister's office was essentially quite weak. Now, in the administrations that followed under Sharon, for example, we all remember that it was Dubi Weissglass, who was then chief of staff. He was not foreign policy advisor, who whenever he wanted to engage the office of the president, he would board an airplane, tell a joke in Yiddish, go and see Candy Rice, come back and tell how beautiful her legs are, and in a very jovial way describe his trip. And that's how he serviced that relationship back and forth. Again, there was no apparatus in the Prime Minister's office that could do much more. The NSC that was formed by Netanyahu at the very last phase of his first government was very remote and not in the loop at all. The same condition continued until under Olmert, but the big change occurred in Israel as a result of the National Security Act in 2008, which had catapulted the NSC into much greater proximity to the Prime Minister, a position that both I held and Yaacov Amidror followed. Now look at how this affected the management of the relationship. When Netanyahu is voted into office, again, there is a Democratic President Obama, but in America, you have at the head of the NSC, Jim Jones, his deputy, Tom Donnellan. Then you also have people we used to know from previous administration, Gary Seymour, Jim Steinberg is at State. But then from State comes Dennis Ross, who joins now the NSC at a very senior position, but he's there. So the NSC becomes now the point of contact much more directly, but much to our pleasant surprise, at the very first visit that Netanyahu comes to Washington, it is the American counterpart who proposes, and this is by now essentially out, proposing to institutionalize the NSC to NSC interface so that each would do the interagency work vis-a-vis their own respective administrations, and it is at the NSC to NSC and through the more intimate channels that they have, everything would be coordinated, engaged in everything. And for that moment on a pace which is tenfold more intensive and frequent than the one we had only 10 years before that, things were coordinated from the top. So now that is why, among other reasons, why people now refer to the state of relations. All concerned can say with absolute assurance, and they're right, that relations, working relations, coordination, consultation has never been as high, and it is now compared to all previous times. This being true also of other channels, often military, intelligence, and the like, but also at the top. The Israeli mechanism now at place is so much better positioned, but also had institutionalized at the American initiative a rhythm and a method that changed the management intensity and in some ways changed everything. For example, all too often one had secure video conferencing discussing issues which were the vehicle in which at the Israeli end were quite a number of Israeli participants from various bodies, but also at the American end. And sometimes what was said today was supposed to be acted on today so that with the next such video conferencing, the next day, results would be reported. Now, that is a pace we could hardly work by, but that was the intensification of the matter. Now, interestingly enough, the NSC is networked into other NSCs, for example, in Europe. They often do that on a multilateral basis. And all too often, Israel was also brought into some other such institutional arrangements that exist between such NSCs, and that had facilitated many things. Now, you can imagine 2 or 3 points of substance. One, that what was discussed here as key issues, such as the Iranian challenge, that was certainly the stuff of coordination, and that was sustained through visits and the like by those mechanisms, and Amidror could tell more. He himself enjoyed excellent relations with his counterpart, Tom Donnellan, when he replaced Jim Jones. I could rely on Jim Jones. Let me tell you what Jim Jones used to tell me. Him being a former commander, I don't know, the Marine Corps, he referred to me as a pal from the Marine Corps. So he was my partner, he said. Being a partner, he said, meant that whenever I needed him, if he's not with the president, he would be available. He said it. But it was put to the test. 5, 6 times I had urgent need to call him, and I called him directly, and I would ask him, where are you? And sometimes he said, in Afghanistan. One day he said, on the tarmac in the airport of Moscow. But he took the call, and he was true to his word. And very much as a result of the effective administrative style of some of our Americans, we adjusted our style, and in a way that has turned into an extremely efficient mechanism for consultation, coordination of policy, and that has changed everything. Process shapes substance. Now, you can also imagine that other matters of significance were on the agenda of those, and indeed, as things turned, the Middle East started to be more dynamic, so to say, it became also a platform to discussing evolving things. But then, as one could also imagine, this is an instrument which is particularly worthwhile at times of emergency and crisis. At that time, the need for high-level coordination of the kind that currently prevails between Israel and America, and as institutionalized once the NSC placed itself at the nerve center in Jerusalem, this has proven and probably will prove itself as vital at a time in which time is of the essence, and you need to get decisions very, very fast, and to manage them. Again, I reiterate the significance of adequate staff work, legwork, and management. That could be vital. So that has actually transformed, and this is what I would argue, the fabric of the management of the Israeli-American special relationship in ways which are not recorded. It has led to many understandings that have been turned into policy. When there was discussion here about Israel's deterrence, let me tell you that all understandings in this business were done at the top. It was always a matter of president vis-a-vis prime minister. Always. Never below that. So this has become the essential place where those understandings are struck, and those understandings are strategic in more sense than one. Things of, as I said, confronting the Iranian challenge and coordinating the sanctions and other things that is necessitated when there is joint action. The fact, by the way, that other allies have the same system. The Brits, who did have a system which was equivalent to the NSC, decided in 2008 to call it as such. So they also had some legislation. They slightly restructured the system they had, and now they too have an NSC, and the man at the head is part of the network, and it is very much a network. And you know, it's an American political scientist, and Anne-Marie Slaughter, who about 10 years ago wrote about the fact that it is international networks that often have closer interaction that they have within their own domestic countries. There is a network of NSC, and there is a network of NSC staffs and heads, and it has its own collegiality and its own method, and it serves a world that is different. Now, one thing that came to improve that much is the evolving technology. Technology has offered now means of communication that provide for much faster and at the same time secure but intimate consultation on a very rapid pace. So if you combine the institutionalization of this mechanism, the creation of this mechanism, and then the fact that it was structured and institutionalized in Israel, then at the American initiative, it had agreed on a method of coordination and cooperation, you could understand when coupled with the technical means and that it has become an extremely important factor in shaping policy or in servicing policy. Now, one could argue that it would always be beneficial even if relationships between the top guys are less than the best. Because when they are less than best, those staffs can help, can overcome, can finesse, can provide for the continuity which is desired when sometimes individuals don't get along. That happens. And of course, it also helps when relationships are smooth, because it helps to implement policy more efficiently. So it is a very welcome development, one that occurred in Israel's history much too late, but thanks to American cooperation had become a major platform for managing the alliance, and managing alliances is a major task for these times. Thank you.
Okay, first of all, let me say that I second everything my colleague said about the depth of coordination between the U.S. and Israel at senior levels. One of the thoughts, though, that your remarks triggered was, especially when you got into the international network of NSC staffs and national security advisors, which is, I think, a profound development that reached something of fruition or efflorescence, and certainly in Obama's first term, is the debate this has generated within the United States, which I will not go into, but is worth mentioning, between those who applaud this kind of arrangement and those who think that it's led to a vitiation of a sound foreign policy process because it marginalizes cabinet secretaries and their departments. There's a very hot and heavy debate now, which, as I said, I won't talk about, but you can ask Dan Shapiro when he shows up. Look, I'm not going to talk that much about the policy process per se anyway, because as those of you who studied international relations know, and as Bismarck once said, the process is like making sausage, and you really don't want to inquire too closely into the making of sausage. So I'll just give some thoughts about U.S. policy as it's played out over the region and how it looks at this point from my perspective as an ex-NSCer. So these are kind of ex post facto. Ben Rhodes is calling me from the White House, telling me to shut up. Sorry about that. Look, I think generally speaking, I'll start off with the bottom line, which is that things look really rather okay considering how bad they look. And I say that because from a policy perspective, I use the word policy, excuse me. I thought I shut it off, I really did. It's my lawyer. The administration was laboring under very serious constraints, really very considerable ones, and I just want to dwell on those constraints, at the outset, because I think it establishes a context for what follows. Implementing a foreign policy requires, among other things, money, and that's something that it was shocking to find when I got back to the White House we didn't have. The kitchen was closed. I mean, there was really nothing, and that for a few reasons. One is that the life cycle cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been calculated to lie within a range of something like $4 to $6 trillion. Even for an economy the size of America's, this is a really very considerable burden. And the burden is made worse, in a sense, by the fact that every penny of what the United States spent in Iraq and Afghanistan was borrowed. The administration at the time did not pay for the war out of revenue. So in addition to the debt, there is interest to be paid on that debt. Now, this in itself would be bad enough, but it's worse, it seems to me in retrospect, because it's synced with two other adverse developments, and the one being the financial meltdown of 2008. That was very costly. It thrust the administration immediately into emergency mode as the new team was confronted with the real possibility of a crippling depression. Not the kind of crippling depression I suffer from right now, but an economic one. And that in itself was compounded by the fact that it robbed the administration of its first year in office. Generally, the first year of a new administration is the year in which it attempts to carry out the core points of the foreign policy that it endorsed during the campaign and that it developed during the years leading up to the campaign, and there was really no chance to do that effectively. But the vast expansion of the money supply at the time and the stimulus package were hugely significant in robbing the administration of the resources that it would have needed, especially as the Arab Spring emerged a couple of years later. And it's not just in the foreign policy domain, but it's also in the defense domain. The Defense Department, of course, will bear the greatest share of this burden. That is the monetary burden that resulted from the commitment to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that will last for a very long time because much of the burden will come in the form of personnel costs, particularly owing to the expansion of eligibility for medical benefits to a wider range of servicemen and women for a wider range of injuries, and these will be very severe outlays over the course of decades. In the meantime, because of the 2008 crisis and the resulting budget, I don't know what to call it really, disaster, the Defense Department will be looking at a much lower budget allocation over the course of the next few years. And by the end of this decade, it will have shrunk close to, I don't know, 1.5 points of GDP. It's hovered around 4% of GDP for most of the past decade, that is 2000 to 2010, and it's likely to be hovering by the end of this decade, and it will get to that point really rather rapidly at about 2.3% of GDP. And that's quite a huge whack at the defense budget, and that's going to make it difficult for the military to do some of the things it might otherwise be called upon to do, because even as its budget is being cut, it needs to repair a lot of the damage to equipment and so forth that it incurred during the wars of the past decade, while at the same time modernizing the force. So this is quite serious. And Efraim raised the question of China in his instructions to us, and I think it's worth mentioning that this sharp reduction in the Defense Department budget, which is, I think, inescapable. It's hard for me to see outside of a national emergency of a World War II kind, the budget allocations being reversed. You've got a very ambitious, let me put it that way, China on the rise, and a very ambitious PLA, and a very ambitious PLA Navy that's engaged in a modernization program that's extremely vigorous. They've got about 190 major combatant vessels now that are built in China. They are much more technologically advanced than they have ever been. So the money that's been removed from the Defense Department budget really makes it much more difficult for the U.S. to keep pace and dominate the the advancement of PLA Navy goals. And, you know, this is a problem because, you know, the Chinese are now talking more openly about the desirability of retaking Taiwan and so forth. These are things that American policymakers need to think about very carefully in a very difficult defense budgetary environment. Now, you know, going back to the Middle East, I think you have to concede, or at least I'm making the claim, that these factors have inhibited or restricted the administration's options in certain circumstances, which I can go into later, but I want to really crack on here. And just cover in a telegraphic fashion, maybe is the best way to describe this. The main points of the administration's policy and the interim returns on that policy, so then we can talk about whether or not this policy has been very successful. The first regards Egypt. Despite misgivings about General Sisi's path to power in Egypt, the administration's policy toward his government at this point is largely what it was towards his recent predecessors. And this is a policy that largely aligns with Israel's policy at this point and with Israel's perceived interests in Egypt. So maybe there's not much to discuss on that score. In Libya, the administration made it very clear from the outset, for reasons that I was describing a second ago, that it would not take ownership for that country and that the burden for it should lie with our European allies. They've taken some steps to stabilize Libya, perhaps an impossible task, but they haven't really been enough. And other regional states, the UAE, Qatar, and Egypt have moved into the vacuum. We'll talk a little bit more about that dynamic in a second. In Tunisia, the U.S. was quite supportive of the new dispensation, as we all know, but it could never really follow through because of budget constraints, which also constrained the degree to which Washington could support Egypt in the perilous years immediately following the revolution. Thank you very much. Just kidding. I get these cards, you know, that say 10 more seconds. No, I'll move on very, very quickly. On Iran, I think things are going for the moment fairly well. Now, you know, some people describe fairly well in this context as the guy who you see falling down, the skyscraper. You look out the window and he's saying, "So far, so good." But the fact is, you know, the extension that we've gotten is the second one, as we know. It limits the number of centrifuges Iran can operate to enrich uranium, which I presume is a good thing. It can't bring any more online. It restricts the level of enrichment to points far below the level necessary to develop a nuclear weapon. Iran gave up its stockpile of uranium enriched to high levels and agreed to enhanced international inspections to ensure compliance. And Iranian assets continue to be frozen. So, and most of the sanctions, in fact, you know, 90% of the sanctions are still in place. So arguably, I'd say, well, you know, a good result thus far. We'll see what happens on March 24th. You know, a deal, by the way, is going to depend on what's happening in Washington politics and Tehran politics, and both of those are highly volatile right now, and it would be a mistake to assume that the administration has any kind of positive control over either. Now, Iran is important also because of divisions that it seems to have deepened between the United States and some of its allies. Now, for the moment, those differences are under control, I think, on Iran, in part because the jury is out on how this latest extension is going to play out. But the differences have instead been displaced onto Syria. Now, from the U.S. perspective, there's not a profound interest in Syria itself. Throughout the Cold War, it sided with the strategic adversary of the United States, the Soviet Union. After that, it sided with another strategic adversary, Iran. We don't have a lot of affinity groups in Syria. There's no long relationship. There's no deep cultural bond. or anything like that, and has nothing to offer the United States in terms of economic value, basing options. We have all we need in Haifa. We don't, need anything in, at Tartus, in Syria. So basically, a country of not huge value to the United States. But there are derivative interests that are quite important: the stability of Jordan, the stability of Iraq, counterterrorism. And so forth, and a humanitarian interest. And all of these are being addressed by the administration really fairly energetically, to my view, while at the same time minimizing an investment in Syria. That would not be consonant with American interests, as I think I conceive them anyway. Now, the difficulty with our allies is that, our priority really is on Iraq, which is why we're fighting ISIS. But from our allies' perspective, the priority should be on the toppling of the Assad regime. And, to this point, we're managing to keep these differences at bay in a coalition. Where the United States is taking certain limited actions to help the moderate opposition, and the rest of the coalition is taking certain steps to help us fight ISIS. But how long that arrangement can continue remains to be seen. Now, one of the challenges, and I'm going to close on this note, one of the challenges that the U.S. has had in managing its interests in the region is that the region itself is split along axes that don't really relate to U.S. interests as we currently conceive them, I think. First, there's a Sunni-Shia split, which from, again, a U.S. perspective, is not one that the U.S. really wants to take sides in. Why would we want to? There's a split between Qatar and Turkey on the one hand, and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates on the other. This is kind of an Arab Cold War. That's another issue that the United States doesn't have an intrinsic interest in taking sides in. And there's an intra-Sunni split over the role of the Muslim Brothers in governance, which is also something that the United States doesn't have a strong interest in involving itself in. But it's extremely important to some of our allies, particularly the United Arab Emirates, to whom we're deferring on this score, at least for the moment. So this all gets to the larger issue of the U.S. role in a region of mobilized populations where authoritarianism and jihad are the most vibrant forms of political expression, outside of Israel, of course. The fact that these developments map to serious structural problems, demographic, economic, and environmental, that bias outcomes towards instability and violence compounds the problem. It's very, very difficult. Now, whether the threat to Sykes-Picot is as serious a threat as some of the panelists have postulated, I'm not really sure. But the key thing is that scope for effectual action is shrinking for the U.S. And that's different than the U.S. not being determined to pursue its interests in the region. And I think that there's been some confusion on that score, which I'm here to remedy. My sense is that it's actually the other way around. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I should start by saying, thanking Efraim, Inbar, and the BESA Center for inviting me today here to address this distinguished panel and the audience. As a national security advisor, I know very well that I'm just a specialist in generalities. So I don't know if I can offer anything relevant to you today, and that's the risk Efraim took very generously inviting me, and I appreciate that, Efraim, really. But having said that, I will try to answer the question you put us, or in front of us for the panel. In Spain, my friends and enemies alike tend to call me Darth Vader. I don't know why exactly, but maybe because I'm a sinister imperialist and very conservative character, I don't know. But even so, if I have to accept that definition, I have to tell you that I don't believe President Obama is Kenyan by birth, or crypto-communist by affinity, or a Muslim brother by inclination. I don't believe that. Despite a few Americans, I mean, you go to Barnes & Noble and you see all the books around about that, few Americans believe, I don't. But I do believe something. I do believe we have the first European Social Democrats American president, which is different. And many of you will say, well, what's the matter with the Social Democrats in the White House?
In your book, it says that.
Well, as a conservative, I don't like Social Democrats because I experienced that in my life. But I understand that some people may feel attraction for 5, 8 weeks holidays during summer, high-speed train crossing all over Europe, the trade unions, and whatever you may think of the Social Democrats in Europe. But the problem with America becoming European is that we enjoyed the life we had in Europe, thanks, because America paid for us. America paid for our security in almost 60 years. America paid for the reconstruction after the Second World War with the Marshall Plan. America has guaranteed our sea lines of communication. America has given us for free trade freedom. And my question to a friend in the White House right after the inauguration of the President Obama, the first inauguration was, who's going to pay for you? The Chinese? The Saudis? Tell me. We got your money, the dollar. Who's going to pay for America's Social Democrats' plans? And that's a problem, but I'll come back to this later. To answer the first question, was the net assessment of American administration. Let me take my notes here. I could say that if I may characterize Obama's policy in 4 words, will be reset, rebalancing, reduce, and retreat. Reset, well, we all remember this button that was given to Lavrov by Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and we know where we are now with Russia over Ukraine. So I think, all in all, the account must be, or the assessment must be a little bit doubtful of the new relationship that the president wanted to have with Moscow. But also there was a second reset. I mean, when President Obama came to Cairo speech, he wanted to be loved by the Muslim world, essentially. Well, we know today that you go to Egypt, according to the Pew Research Center, the people who believe that America is an enemy has increased dramatically in the last 2 years, as in Pakistan, for instance. So I don't think the policy of getting a new image and a new kind of sensibility towards the world has produced many results in favor of a pro-American view across the globe. So the reset policy, doubtful. The rebalancing, I think the pivot to Asia that was called rebalancing was announced with the deployment of 2,500 Marines in the Great Barrier Reef, Northern Australia, which has not taken place yet, as far as I know, but little else, because reality is what it is, and the balancing has been thwarted by other more pressing issues. So the rebalancing may be a long historical trend, but has not materialized yet as it was announced so noisily in the past. Reduce the footprint of America in many places, yes. Reduce the military presence from Iraq. Reduced the military presence from Afghanistan, for instance, 2 places where, unfortunately, I think the American president has made the right decision, changing the gear and introducing advisors in Iraq and calling for a new deployment in Afghanistan, despite the deadlines that he set himself. But yeah, I think there's a trend of recalling the presence of the United States from the world back to America, which I call the retreat philosophy. I think some people in Washington may believe that not being present will cause less friction and that will create less problems. But actually, we have seen that the president who got the Peace Nobel Prize is now engaging in almost 6 different wars or combat operations across the region and the world. So I don't think this retreat, or whatever it may be called, is producing the desired effects that were originally thinking. So all in all, I would say that after 8 years or 6 years in the White House, because of the very complex trends in the world, globalization, whatever, because of the sometimes bad decisions that have been taken, the world today, and I'm just quoting Henry Kissinger in his latest book, is a more chaotic world than it was 6 years ago. It was 15 years ago, actually. So my assessment is lukewarm at best, and a little bit critical at worst, no? In the sense that I think bad decisions produce bad policies, and bad policies tend to produce bad results in the field. And I think the President Obama has taken wrong decisions in the past regarding Europe, regarding Russia, regarding the ISIS, regarding Iraq, and the Taliban, and his focus on the Al-Qaeda central in the counterterrorism policy. So I think if I were to give an assessment, it would be a minus at least. And the other question you put us in front of us, Efraim, was how do we see America, the US in 2020 or so? Well, I don't have any crystal ball anymore in my office, but I will try. I will try to give you some ideas. I think it depends relatively on whether you believe the US is in retreat or is in decline, which are two different things. Retreat, as you can read the latest book by Bret Stephens, who believes that America is in retreat. Retreat is the product and the result of a specific set of policies, and that can be changed with a new president or with a new leadership in the country. Decline is something much more profound and deeper. There are more social, economic, moral trends that may produce a more impotent country to shape events internally and externally. I don't know to which school I believe or I belong to. Probably I'm an eclectic, and I could say that retreat will accelerate decline. But also because of the economic and domestic problems, and because the social democrat mentality, the leadership in the US today may think that they are not able to do the things that they did in the past because they need to, in the president's words, start nation building at home. Could be, but the fact is that every time America has looked inward, the world has been much more risk prone, and America has to intervene later on a much more difficult platform. So I don't know what American would be, but if it's Hillary the president or if it's a Republican in 2020, I don't know. But if you look at the summer in 2013, when the debates about the the red lines over Syria, it was fantastic to see how the Republicans in the House were opposing any military intervention or action. Based on different reasons, it was ineffective, too little, too late, but many of them because they were having thousands of calls from the constituencies saying, we don't want any longer more intervention abroad. And that's what I linked with the social democrat that I will start in the very beginning. I think in Europe it is clear cut that social democrat policies has produced a society that is indifferent and apathic, and probably feeling impotent to shape things in the world. And I wouldn't like to see the city upon the hill that has been America in the last quarter of century to take this path, because there is no alternative to American leadership in the world. Nobody could take the leadership of America away and preserve our Western democratic liberal values. If there's any challenger, it will be illiberal, autocratic, or whatever you want to think about it, but it's not from the Western world. And that's why the American elite should understand that yes, it's painful, it's costly, but it's in America's own interest to keep the leadership role that has been played in the last century. Because if not, the world becomes unmanageable. When we don't pay attention to ISIS, it becomes the Islamic State. It's not because of the beheading alone, it's because it's swapping northern Iraq, threatening with a catastrophic collapse of the country. It's reaching out the border of Jordan, threatening this country as well. And there are other issues. I mean, the START treaty, which is good, reducing the nuclear warheads in both parties, America and Russia. Thank you. It's a good thing to do, but it was announced from the White House last May that they were reaching the limits 2 years in advance, the same day that the Russians were testing the new ICBM. So you have to be careful on what the other sides are doing, and that's something I think, because of the focus on domestic policy, sometimes I think the current White House leader is not paying too much attention to that. But again, with a warning sign that America should not become European at all. I thought in the past that everything that happened in America will happen in Europe 10 years later. I don't want to see that the reverse trend, that what is happening in Europe will happen in America in the next 10 years. I always thought that America wasn't my best option, and followed by Israel as the last option. I think now Israel is the only option I have. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Efraim. Thank you for bringing me back to Israel. I suppose in return I should answer your questions, I think. But before I do that, I come from a region which I think prides itself on thinking that we are the place where the balance of power has shifted most rapidly in the last few decades. I think we're in competition with the Middle East for that. So let me first make a few general points, and then, because today there is a prevailing narrative in Asia at least of US decline. And it's fed, sadly, by US commentary, most of this. And yet, the standard against which all other states measure power, measure influence, status, and is still the US. And even its adversaries rely on the US for the global public goods which make it possible, whether it's the internet, whatever it is, whether it's freedom of the oceans, of the seas, and so on. So I personally think that it's really premature to write off the US for many reasons, because the US is not in decline by objective criteria. If you look at the world order, it's still primarily Western, run, designed, managed by the US. And there is no alternative in sight. Nor is there any peer or competitor of the US in terms of military capability, in terms of economic reach, in terms of technology, or control over finance, or energy, or soft power. I mean, you go through the whole range. So even though power is being redefined, it's being redistributed through the system, but it's still the US that's the only superpower, and that seems likely to stay so for the foreseeable future. Besides, I'm an old man. I'm old enough to have remembered many times in the past when the US was written off. 73 oil shock, 75 fall of Saigon. Every time we were told it's all over, that's it, that's the end of US hegemony. And the US is the only power I know in history which has a capability to reinvent itself over and over again. The problem now is therefore not the objective reality. I think the problem now is this general perception that somehow that the US has lost interest in the rest of the world, that domestic political gridlock in the US makes it impossible for the US to actually intervene and participate. And, you know, phrases like leading from behind don't help, frankly. I mean, that just sort of sums it up in one place and conveys entirely the wrong image. There's only one power in the world today which hopes to be mentioned in the same breath as the US, and that's China, which happens to be our big neighbor. But if you look at it objectively, China is still limited by three main factors. There might be others. It's in a very crowded geopolitical environment where there are other powers which are also rising. It doesn't have a tabula rasa in which to operate. Regime stability is still a major concern internally. So there are domestic preoccupations. And she depends on the US for her own continued growth and future prosperity. I mean, that's just a fact of economic interdependence between the US and China, which didn't exist between the Soviet Union and the US. And so we're talking about a very different kind of course, the US has problems adjusting to the new balance of power, to the new situation in the world. It still has to come to terms, I think, with this post-Cold War world. So why am I saying all this? Me, an Indian, standing here in Tel Aviv and saying all this? Because frankly, India and China together are the greatest beneficiaries of the 2 decades of free trade, investment flows, which lasted from the end of the Cold War until 2008, until the economic crisis, and which was organized really by the West after winning the Cold War. And so long as it has been in the US interest, and it has been since World War II, to keep the world open and integrated to her own economy, and secured by ensuring that US power can reach everywhere in the globe, the US has kept the global commons open and been a major and been the provider of global public goods. So the problem is therefore the sense today that somehow the US willingness to continue to do so, to maintain the system, has diminished. Now there is a law in optics, in physics, which says that an image cannot be better than reality. And that's true. But physics also says that the image can be worse than reality. And I think that's what we're seeing here with the US, in this, when you ask about the substance and the reality. Because what seems to be happening is that the perception of the US standing in the world is much worse than the actual objective reality of US standing. And perceptions matter because leaders, countries, people act on them. So I think it's important that, in fact, it's probably the perception of an unwilling or hesitant US which contributed to some of the mess in Syria and Libya and in other places, in the Ukraine possibly. So how should we react to this? Countries like Israel, like India, and how do we react to this gap really between perception and reality? I think for us, for India, our approach has been fairly simple. At essence, the core hard security issues, we look after ourselves to the extent that we can. Territorial integrity, military defense, I mean, that's something we take care of ourselves. We can't expect other people to do. There's a whole range of other security issues, trans-border, transnational, some of the broader ones, energy security, maritime security, some of the counterterrorism issues, on which we cannot do it alone. We have to work with others, and the US is the major partner for that. And frankly, we've got used to the good life, to depending on the US to provide the global public goods that make that possible. Our worry today is that these relationships can't be turned on and off depending on today's perception or which administration is in power or which isn't. So we've tried very hard to insulate our relationship with the US from US domestic politics. In that sense, I think we're slightly different from Israel. You've made a virtue out of the fact that you happen to be part of US domestic politics. We've so far managed to keep it bilateral, bipartisan. I hope we can manage to continue to do that and ensure. So let me try, with this background, let me try and answer your 3 questions. I mean, you said, how do you evaluate US policy? You know, Gandhiji was asked in London in 1936, what do you think of British civilization? And he said it would be a good idea. No, but I exaggerate. I exaggerate. No, what I mean is, whether the US is realist or not, you know, the fact is that US policy today is less predictable and US intervention is less certain. Maybe thanks to 2008, the crisis, whatever. In India, the perception of the US has varied over time within the political class, within the elite. But it's been remarkably consistent among the population. The Gallup organization has done polls in India since 1956 on asking people to rank which countries do you admire the most. And the US has consistently, I mean, even at the height of the Vietnam War, whenever, it's always been in the top 3. In 2005, 2008, when we had a big political battle at home on the civil nuclear initiative with the US, one reason the government could stand firm, even though it didn't have the numbers in parliament and that took some time to organize, was because the polls consistently showed us that 93% of the population supported what we were doing with the US. And that was steady. So popular support, I mean, this is an aspirational country where real estate developments are called Malibu Beach and Orange County and so on. So popular support for that relationship and the popular estimation of US policy has been consistent. That is not true of the political elite, of the political class in India, where it has varied tremendously. But it has steadily been uphill. Policy wonks in India will complain that the US has not stayed the course in Afghanistan or dealt successfully with terrorism out of Pakistan. But these are criticisms of degree. And quite frankly, as an Indian, I think we should be grateful for the fact that the US fought our war for us for free in Afghanistan for so many years. I don't think we can ask for more than that. You asked, what should the US do? Well, the honest answer is please do what suits our interests, but that would be unreasonable to expect. But what we would like is really 3 things of the US. Clearer, more rational and consistent policies towards China and Pakistan. We continued and strengthened cooperation actually, in dealing with non-traditional threats, cyber, and to keep providing the global public goods that have made these changes possible in the last few decades. I mean, keeping the global commons open and so on. And your last question, since you keep showing me this piece of paper, the US position in 2020, well, I think this depends on your evaluation of where I started, on whether you believe this narrative of US decline or not. I would actually expect the wheel to have turned and to see the US re-engaged and actively remaking the open, liberal global order that we all continue to need. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. I was surprised by the fact that more Indians support America than Israelis, although the percentage in Israel is higher. But, you know, I want to make 2 remarks about the previous speech. One, I agree with Uzi about the network of national security councils. It's very important. I learned how important it is in the last job, and I did whatever is needed to widen the network and to make all the technological arrangements that it can be implemented not just with United States of America, but with others. I think it's very important to the State of Israel that NSC can speak with another NSC wherever you want, in every corner of the globe. It's very important. And if someone in the Foreign Office dislike it, we can arrange it. That's the first myth. The second one, I more than agree with my good friend from India, Menon, about how America real image is related to its real strength. I don't have to go through what I wrote as preparation to what I had to say, but I believe if you look at the United States of America, compare it to the others, including China, no one is in the military capability of the United States of America, not even close to that. No one technologically is near the United States of America, and no one is in the same strengths of economy, with all due respect to all the others who are rising now. But I think there are some issues that led to this image of the United States of America. And I think that there are two issues. One is the feeling of too many that the United States of America is more reluctant to invest in many places and more happy to retreat before finishing the job. I understand why. The Americans are tired from being those who are fighting the wars of others since the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, the war against terrorism, and at the end of the day, what they get, as we saw yesterday, Yankees go home. In some of the cases, people add and take us with you. Because in most of these cases, people are shouting against America. At the same time, they want to go to America and to make the American lifestyle. So it's kind of a problem within the view that people look at America. They understand this is the only one. And when Americans are going out, no one is going in but ISIS. There is not any substitute in the world to the American will and capabilities. And if there is a situation in which there is no American will, no one is doing the job. And this is the problem. There are some areas like Iraq or Afghanistan, the Americans are not willing to make the job. And no one is coming in to take the responsibility. What the Americans did when the Brits reversed from some areas in the world 100 years ago. So this is the problem, that the Americans are more reluctant to invest and no one is coming in their shoes. And it's empty. And this is the problem. Yes, we heard yesterday. I remember that there was an argument in Rome after the first election when President Obama was elected, before the inauguration of President Obama. And people from NATO spoke about the American will to new administration to build coalitions, not to do everything by itself. And it was clear for me that the Americans can have dreams about it. The Europeans do not have the ability to take part in real coalition. I mean, they can call it a coalition, they will be member of the coalition, but at the end of the day, it's the intelligence of the Americans, the Air Force of the intelligence, it's the Navy of the Americans. Yes, they are members of the coalition. And I was surprisingly read that a week ago, one of the attacks against ISIS, one of the bombs against ISIS was done by 7 members of the coalition. Ask yourself who was there and who did what. And what is the percentage of the Americans in these 7 members of the coalition? So politically it's much easier, but practically the free world didn't build independent capability to deal with the problems without the United States of America. There are very few exceptions. India is an exception. Israel is an exception. But in many other places around the world, what can they do without Americans? And Americans want them to do without America, and it doesn't work. So I think that here there is kind of a misunderstanding about America. America is Of course, after the crisis of 2008, it is not as strong as it was, economically at least. After the price that they pay for the two big wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they're not as strong as they were, but still, it's the only superpower in the world. And it is going to be the only superpower for the next decade at least. What will happen after 10 years, I don't know. Two new presidents, changes around the world, and so on and so forth. So, for the next 10 years, from the Israeli point of view, there is no substitute to the United States of America. Remind yourself. We are getting from the United States of America every year $3.5 billion. I don't know who will bomb Iran. But if Iran will be bombed, I can promise you it will be American-made aeroplanes. I can promise you. When we need a shield in the Security Council, with all due respect to all the others, it's the American vote. And so on and so forth. There is no substitute to the relations between Israel and the United States of America. There are two issues on which we don't agree. One is what Israel should do to have an agreement with the Palestinians. We are not ready to compromise on our security, and the Americans try to convince us that we have to take more risks. The Americans do not like what we do with the settlements. By the way, it's not just the Americans. There is not even one leader around the world who agree with what we are doing with our settlements. Not even one. No. No, you are wrong about that. You are very wrong about that. Don't mix Sisi's attitude towards Hamas with Sisi's attitude toward our settlements. Huge mistake that many Israelis are doing. Huge mistake. Okay, sorry, I forgot. Uzi, don't waste time on that. And there are some areas in which we don't agree with the Americans relating to the Palestinians, mainly because there is kind of a religion that too many Americans believe. That if the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will be solved, it will solve some problems in the Middle East. Sorry to tell you the truth. Nothing will be solved in the Middle East, even if you have an agreement with the Palestinians. Nothing. And some Americans believe that it will change the Middle East somehow. Few and few today, but 2 years ago, you could hear very important people in America preaching, explaining, wasting time to try to convince us that just have an agreement with the Palestinians and the Middle East will look differently. Today, less and less, but still, there are still some Americans who think that it is very important. One of the most important changes in the Middle East if will be an agreement between us and the Palestinians. So the Palestinian area is one issue in which we have disagreement with the Americans, mainly about security and the issue of the settlement. The other area is Iran. For many Americans, an agreement with Iran is the most important achievement that this administration can get in its 8 years term. From our perspective, if the basis for this agreement is the interim agreement, is another milestone in the way of making Iran nuclear. And because this is a threat to our existence, we are not ready to compromise with the Americans about that. And we are very strong about it, and we are very clear about it. It will not tie the hands of Israel. And the Americans understand what does it mean. And they really don't like it. And they don't like that inside America, there are many who believe that Israel is right. And the Americans make just two numbers. The Americans began the negotiation when they told everyone around the world that they are very strong. The Iranians will have 500 centrifuges, because 0 is not a good beginning. From the newspaper, I understand that now what is the offer on the table is 4,500. Anyone can be sure that this is the end. So it's 9 times more, only to, you begin with 500 to save face of the Iranians. At the end of the day, you finish with 4,500, and now the Iranians will have to save your face. And this is only one number. So from what we understand, and I'm not in the system anymore, so I'm not familiar with the details, but from what I read in the newspapers, I understand this is going to be a bad agreement. And that will be, no question, a huge issue between us and the Americans. And yes, based on the system that you heard about from Uzi, we share information, we are on the same page when it is coming to technical questions, and so on and so forth. But about the substance, what is more important, to have an agreement or the content of the agreement? We think that the content of the agreement is more important than the agreement. Too many Americans believe that the agreement is more important than the content of the agreement. So these are the two issues that on which we differ from the Americans. We see the reality different than the Americans. It's are very important issues. It's not something that should be neglected. But at the same time, remember again, the relations between the United States of America and Israel are very strong, although we have disagreement about these two issues. When it is coming to security, when it is coming to intelligence, when it is coming to our economy, when it is coming to vote in the United Nations, whatever, we look around Israel problems and you see how we get a lot of help from the Americans. I know Americans are not doing only because we share the same values, but the fact that we share the same values is this fact is very important. It's not the only issue, but it's a very important one. And we should try to do our best in the future first to be involved with the Americans, to try to be as bipartisan as possible, and to understand that even between good friends might be some disagreements. And we can be good friends although we have these disagreements. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we'll have a second round. Each one is can 5 minutes make additional remarks or react to somebody else's point of view on the panel. Uzi.
All Israelis who have been observing processes in the United States have been questioning themselves what to do should the United States be indeed either in a retreat or in a decline. Everybody realizes that this may not be predetermined. Everybody knows that things are reversible. But to take that possibility into account has become necessary. And there was a range of reactions. Some have thought that if that were to be the case, Israel has to seek alternatives. And then started to look, and all kinds of ideas have been floated. Some say we could go in the footsteps of America and pivot east. And suggestions were made at the highest levels that we have Asian options. By the way, Asian options need not necessarily mean China. Certainly India has always been there and is a pillar of our Asian policy in a way. But there are also other powers in Asia which could add up. Japan, Korea, Australia, Singapore, Indonesia. So Israel does have a range of Asian options, but do they add up to anything that could even constitute an alternative to America? Not even in the dreams of all the proponents of that. There have been others who, yesterday I saw that Barak, former Prime Minister Barak, had come against those who said that China was an alternative partner. He said, no, it's Europe. Well, Europe, yes, maybe so, there are many of us, but we all look at Europe as a derivative of the Israeli-American orientation. That's the Atlantic orientation that has been the canonical or traditional Israeli orientation anyway. But there have been other people who looked north and south. For example, our foreign minister is very cognizant of the fact that Russia offers certain maneuvering space, and even Africa, an old hunting ground for Israeli influence on its own. So it looked at the moment as if there's a tutazimut possibility, but not really. Most serious Israelis realize that we are with America. So somebody had said, if America is retreating, should we jump ship? Should we go down with the ship? So people said we should be working with the indispensable ally, even as it goes through all kind of turns. It may not be going one way. But there was one Israeli I heard who had the chutzpah and said it is in our powers to make America stronger. Now, I like that one. I asked him, how? Are we going to fight in Afghanistan? He said, no, but in certain areas we do have the ability to marginally assist America regain some of its strength. So much for America, but America remains its indispensable ally. In this case, however, to react to what Amidror had said, what happens when allies differ and disagree? Well, if this were to be a debate or intellectual scene, then clearly one could be at one's own position. But Dan, we've been mentioning you as an old pal from the NSC period, so welcome. But certain things in life cannot be separated. You can't split that hairs. And in certain areas, there is no alternative but to joint action. You have no unilateral action. You have no unilateral options. Even America needs allies. Look how much, through what efforts America does need coalition partners, not to be of equal weight, but to render certain services, access, capabilities which are necessary. The pooling of resources is necessary not just for legitimacy, it's sometimes for feasibility. So joint action and action by partners is the rule today, and therefore one should not assume that one can have a real unilateral action. So even on Iran, it has always been a joint effort, and I think the effort to prevent Iran from becoming nuclear remain one in which we have to work at it together and jointly. I don't think that any has a genuine, effective, and long-lasting, independent, unilateral option. I still think that jointly it could arrive at. The purpose remains, and we shall have to wait and see. Same about Middle East options, that is to say peace options. Well, in areas in which we think we can shape our future by taking it into our hands, I wish ourselves luck. That maneuvering space is smaller and smaller. And besides, often we stand to benefit from engaging others. So independence is not necessarily a virtue. Sometimes it's a liability. We used to call it isolation. We feared isolation. We sought partners. Now that we have them, we insist on claiming our self-reliance, not when it is impossible or unproductive.
As usual, Uzi has spoken very wisely and I think profoundly on the issues, and I want to elaborate on them overly much, really. What's striking here is, to go back to General Amidror's remarks, there are two serious issues that divide Israel and the United States right now, and they're becoming more difficult to paper over, as General Amidror was indicating. On the issue of the peace process, I have to say that, at least in recent memory, before that, who knows, the United States has not pressed Israel to carry out a peace process of any kind with the Palestinians in order to somehow reshape the broader Middle East. I'm not sure anybody ever really believed that, but we did press Israel on this score because we felt it was in our mutual interest, and I emphasize mutual, which is to say in Israel's interest to do a deal with the Palestinians. That was just a core view of just about every U.S. administration that I served in, and certainly the Obama administration. So I just wanted to emphasize that point. On the issue of Iran, the proliferation of centrifuges to which General Amidror referred took place under sanctions and no talks. Talks have achieved a freeze in the number of centrifuges. So I think just on the basis of logic and experience, one would think that talks would be a good approach to this problem, rather than simply sanctions, although if the talks fail, presumably there will be a return to sanctions, and, well, sanctions still are in effect, we have to bear in mind, but perhaps intensified sanctions. The President of the United States has said that the U.S. would not allow Iran to get a nuclear weapon. He said that on a number of occasions, and he said it pretty clearly. These are very deep waters, and it's not apparent how the United States would walk back on those words or would want to walk back on them. The underlying point here is that the U.S.-Israeli alliance is I wouldn't say at risk or threatened, but it's at a very delicate stage right now because these two profound issues divide us. So we need to take extra care and be very deliberate in the way we deal with each other on these issues to avoid a break which would threaten the strategic interests of both our countries in an increasingly dangerous region. Thank you.
Just a brief philosophical point more than a strategic or political one. I always love the quote by Winston Churchill when he said that Americans always do the right thing after having exhausted all other options. So I would like to wait until that moment that America reverse gear and do the right thing for the world and for America. I don't know what it would take for the mood of today's America to change that. We saw in the 40s with Pearl Harbor, we saw it with 9/11. I wouldn't want to see again a dramatic event. We need to find a more creative, a positive changing game event for the US. But I think this defeatist vision that you cannot get out of the military use of force any decisive victory, or that America is exhausted because of the wars they have been fighting the last 15 years. I think we need the leadership. We need the leader that reverse and change that narrative, because that narrative runs into impotence and paralysis. And it's not true. It's not true. You can defeat your enemies using military force. We have seen that in many places and many times. And America is not paying more for the military than in the past, on the contrary. So this narrative has to be combated by their own leadership in the White House. And when the president goes to the West Point Academy and say that the use of military force is almost irrelevant, I think is wrong in transmitting this image. And that's what we have to fight. We need America with a new narrative of the benign, hegemonic role in the world if we want a better world for anyone else. Thank you.
Well, for my job is very simple. I agree with everything they've said, but more important, I wanted to clarify that Yaacov and I did not coordinate what we said, and yet, instinctively, we both said very similar things. On Iran, though, there is a problem, because I think the problem is fundamental. We don't have an agreement among ourselves. This is not just between Israel and the US, but all of us, on what would be an acceptable outcome of the negotiations. What would give us assurance that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon? And until we're clear about that, I think we will go on arguing about whether the negotiation is going to be successful or not. And we are really arguing process rather than the substance of the issue. But I did want to say that the Brotherhood of NSAs, well, Sisterhood, Brotherhood, is obviously working. considering how much agreement there is between all of us here.
I don't want to argue about Iran. My view is very clear. With all due respect, I think that there is a gap between the promises of the president and the results of the agreement that we might face. I wanted only to emphasize that although there are disagreements between us and the Americans on key issues, and we should be clear about that and don't try to put too many screens around it. Yes, we don't agree about the Palestinian and the importance of an agreement. It's important, by the way. I think it's very important, but for the state of Israel, it will not change the Middle East. None of the problems of the Middle East will be solved by agreement between us and the Palestinians. It's important for us to have an agreement with the Palestinians. Standalone does not relate to the Middle East. It will make our life in the Middle East easier with other Arab countries and so on and so forth, and with the Palestinians themselves. But I don't agree with you. But I think what important, that was my emphasis, that although there are these two important disagreements, it is the interest of Israel to strengthen the relations between Israel and the United States as much as possible on a bipartisan basis. And there is no substitute. We have to make whatever is needed to have better relations with China and India and Japan, and I mentioned only three big countries. None of them is a substitute to our relations with the United Nations, with the United States. Don't make a mistake. And it will be a huge mistake for any Israeli to think that there is such a substitute. I don't know, 50 years from now, no one knows what will happen. But for the foreseen future, there is no substitute to those relations. And I can tell you, although we have these disagreements, in other areas, the relations in some cases are stronger than ever. And it's important to keep it in this way and to do whatever is needed. And there are, no free lunch. In some occasions, you have to compromise and to close your mouth and not to say what you think publicly. But at the end of the day, this is so important that we should do it. And those who don't understand, do not understand how important are these relations to the state of Israel. And we should be very careful not to harm this kind of relations. It's the end.
Thank you to our exceptional panel. And we will... Chef, you go out. Okay? Okay, Yordi.